new take on a very old way of writing about people. And I hope we might hear a bit about that as well. So tonight, of course, because of all the problems, we can't actually physically give Anne her prize. So we've had rather complicated arrangements in the post whereby Anne's prizes have been sent. And I think she's now going to open the prizes for us, if it's possible. I don't
Yes,
know.
that's right. Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you for those very kind words. And
delighted that you should win that prize.
I feel as if I'm on some kind of 1950s quiz show. Goodness me. Gosh, this looks wonderful. There's a wonderful box tied with a black ribbon here. Gosh, this may take a bit of time, but there are the tantalizing words Mont Blanc on it. That bodes rather well.
They're rather good at rapping, aren't they?
Rustle of rapping going on.
Mont Blanc pen.
Gosh, it's been so well wrapped, much better than I.
Very appropriate.
Yeah.
Goodness. Oh, that's wonderful. It's so stylish. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, it's a pleasure.
And that's exactly the sort of thing I write with.
Oh, good.
You know, that particular sort of ballpoint. So that is very nice indeed. Thank you, Jane. And thanks to all the Biographers Club for having nominated me and decided on me. I'm very flattered and very pleased.
And good, excellent. And tonight, Anne is going to be in conversation with Dan Franklin. And Dan is a maestro publisher who was publishing director at Cape for nearly 25 years and became a legendary man for spotting the winners. Now, it's interesting that all of Anne's books, I think, were published by Cape. And Dan...
All but one.
Oh, all but one. But
yes, all but the first, which was IB Taurus.
Oh, right. But Dan has edited Anne's books at Cape from Pontius Pilate on. And so there's a long working history between them. So I think let's start the conversation. Dan,
could I just say, sorry to interrupt, could I just say, if you would like to ask a question, there'll be time for questions at the end.
Thank you very much.
You can leave them in the chat room. You'll find a chat button at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for that. Over to Dan.
Hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, I see you now. Yes.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to say my congratulations to Anne Wroe. She is quite the most remarkable author, and she fully deserves this prize. One of the things that makes her so remarkable, and I've never met anybody. I was in publishing for 50 years. I've never met anybody else who did this, a non-fiction writer. Anne writes the books first. So you, as her editor, have no idea what it is that's arriving in the brown paper parcel that lands on your desk. And each time, it's the most extraordinary surprise. It started with Pilate, and as you can imagine, the books went on, and they became more surprising as they went on. But Anne you began working for The Economist in 1976?
Yes, that's right.
And then you were books and arts editor, 88 to 92, US editor, 92 to 2000, obituaries editor since 2003, and you've edited The Economist Style Guide, which I imagine was a labor.
It really was.
Right.
It's always out of date.
But your first book, which you briefly mentioned, published by IB Tauris, which is called Lives, Lines, and the Iran-Contra Affair, came out of your time as the US editor. I was just interested reading about that book. I haven't actually read it, but it sounds very much like what has been going on in America in the White House recently, in that Reagan was very nearly impeached, was he not?
Yes, that's right, but not for anything half so serious as Mr. Trump is, I think. It was strange, that book. I mean, that was what got me into writing books. And it was all a little bit of a sleight of hand, because I was obsessed by this scandal, which I was covering for the paper. And I wanted to keep going to Washington, even though I'd been made books and arts editor, which actually didn't please me at all. So in order to continue going to Washington to do my research in the Library of Congress, I pretended that I was writing a book. And I thought at the end I'd better write the book so that I didn't seem a complete fool. And I found I greatly enjoyed doing it. So I carried on after that. And every 4 years, as Dan said, a parcel would arrive on his desk at Cape. And I must say at this point, I can't imagine a more forbearing and tolerant editor who would, not ever ask me to write a synopsis. I never felt I could, because I didn't know where the books were going. And he never even asked me what subject it was, but just happily took up whatever I produced.
Sometimes we'd lunch and I'd ask you, and you'd be very, very kind of
cagey. I didn't even tell my husband. I really do believe in secrecy when you're writing. Because I think you have in your head something like a bubble, a wonderful bubble of ethereal matter, which is going to be the book, which is going to be the most wonderful thing that ever was known. And if you start speaking about it, then the whole thing just pops, and that's the end of it. It becomes a pedestrian thing.
Your second book was called A Fool and His Money. And it was a sort of, it was about Rodez in the south of France, which was a town that was divided between two masters. And it's about a merchant who has forgotten where he's buried his gold. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. And there's then a long and detailed court case.
That's right, that's where all the information came from. It was quite an extraordinary case. I mean, the material was amazing. And that in a way was my first biographical book, because although it's not about one, well, it is almost about one person. It is about this merchant, but seen through the eyes of 6 or 7 of his neighbors and relations. And I really went through their lives in the context of the case, so that they were giving his views of him. I mean, the court documents were incredible, considering they were from the 14th century. You just heard these people talking. And so in each chapter, there was a medieval voice, a particular voice speaking. And I think that was what got me onto the route of biography.
And medieval history was your subject at university?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yes, that was my thesis, that book. There was only one sentence in it that survived from my thesis. Because
the book was your thesis? So.
Well, it was about that town, yes. And so, but the only sentence that survived was something about income tax. And the rest of the book was, was everything good that I'd had to leave out of the thesis, all the color, all the all the swear words, you know.
And you can read medieval French?
It was in Occitan, which is like Catalan.
Right.
Very bad Latin. The Latin was so bad that OUP wouldn't actually publish me, because they thought, well, that was probably why I ended up at Cape. I couldn't get it published by OUP because they didn't believe how bad the Latin was and thought it was my fault. It wasn't, it was 14th century notaries' faults.
Well, I've never heard that. That's wonderful. Thank you, fate. Which brings us, I think it's probably it's probably my favorite book of yours, which is Pilate, which is, as Jane described, the most extraordinary book. I just wondered if you could say something about how it came about and what work was involved. This is a book that covers the whole world almost, this book. And so it's as a piece of research, it's completely extraordinary. And it began, you used to go to Mass at Westminster Abbey on Westminster Cathedral on the way to work, is that right?
Mm. Well, when I
And
dropped the
is-
boys off at school, yes, then I would
Right.
go back and go to Mass. And I would always drift off during the sermon. I don't like sermons. And where I would always sit in that particular chapel was where there's Eric Gill's First Station of the Cross, which has it's a wonderful relief of Pilate facing Christ. They're on the same level. And I just thought one day while I was staring at it, you know, we think and write so much about one man in this picture, but what about Pilate? What about him? And then I found, to my delight, there were no biographies. And the field was mine as far as I knew. And I suppose I soon found out why there were no biographies, because there isn't really much left at all. You know, there's a few coins, there's one bit of an inscription, there's even the chapters of Tacitus that ought to have something about him have vanished. But instead of having a man there that you could really track historically, you had this imagined figure who was in the mystery plays, he was in all kinds of fiction writing, he was in the apocryphal acts of the Gospels, and he was even in Bulgakov. So I just followed every single footnote in every single book I could find that would tell me something about him. All these little bits were put together like a jigsaw puzzle. And I spent a horrible amount of time up on the 5th floor of the London Library in the religious section, which I think has never been dusted since Carlyle's day. And in these musty old volumes, just trying to find out absolutely everything I could. So that's why it looks like such a massive work of research. It's just one footnote after another and one weird tale after another. It's my favorite book too, I think, because it was such a joy to write. It really was. I've always been looking for another character like that, who is both ancient, who both was a historical figure and also survives somehow into the modern age as a character we all identify with in some way. I mean, my opening quote was from Tony Blair about how he always felt rather sorry for Pilate. That was why it was so good, you know, perfect subject, I thought.
It's about the beginning, the very, very beginning of the book.
Oh, that was a great moment. I can still remember it. That was following up, you know, the 100th footnote to a shipwreck in the 19th century when the ship was carrying documents or ancient Coptic accounts of Pilate, and they went down. I think some of them survived from the wreck. And I was reading the account in the Times, in the London Library again, and it was so gripping. It was fantastic. And I thought that this has got to be the beginning of the book, as this is going to grab everybody and make them come in, you know, not some rather dull setting of the context of ancient Rome or something like that, but I can get them kind of laboring around in the waves with this ship. So that was good, and that may have been the beginning of trying to write biography rather experimentally, not taking it chronologically, but taking it by themes, which I've done ever since.
Next book, Perkin. I've got a sign saying my internet connection is unstable, but I will carry on. And it's a story of deception. It's a story of Perkin Warbeck, who was a young man who suddenly emerged claiming to be Richard of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower. He was either a prince or he was a jumped up lad from Flanders. And what's riveting about it is the way that you show how at that particular time, if you looked like a prince and you spoke like a prince and you dressed like a prince, you pretty well were a prince. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I remember there was a time in the writing of it when I was wandering on Hampstead Heath, and I suddenly thought, this book is all about seeing, it's all about perception. And in fact, you know, that theme of people not being seen for what they are or being seen for something they're not is very dominant through the book, I suppose. And the way we judge people and the way we name people by the way we look at them, it is all about the actual action of seeing and judging. And what I also rather enjoyed with that one was that his name keeps changing. So he's Richard in certain circumstances, and then he becomes Perkin. He just becomes this trumped up figure in other circumstances. And you almost feel that the two personalities are warring in his head. I mean, we still don't know who he was. And another motivation for me to write that book, it was a very old interest of mine. I'd been interested in him since I was 14 or so. But another impetus was to say, we actually don't know who this is. And I'm tired of historians saying, yes, he was definitely one thing or definitely the other. I do think you've got to leave room for doubt all the time in biography, because our evidence is so limited always. We're only making guesses and suppositions of these people, and especially of what they thought. You know, we really take quite a risk, I think, every time we write such a thing.
And had you started writing it when you were 14?
Yes, I wrote it in geography exercise books. I've still got them. But it was going to be a novel. And then I somehow ran out of steam. I think I ran out of steam when I realized I'd have to do a sex scene, and I wasn't quite prepared for that. So it lingered, and then it died. And then when I'd written Pilate and was thinking, oh goodness, what on earth can I write next? That suddenly came into my mind, and I thought, well, why not? And went and found all my ancient notes that I typed on my father's typewriter, and took it from there.
Wonderful. So the next book is Being Shelley,
Yes.
which is an attempt, an extraordinarily successful attempt to actually get inside Shelley's mind. Was that what you were trying to do?
Yes, that's what I'm always trying to do, actually. I think sometimes, well, I know I tried to get inside Pilate's, and that put me in a very bad mood. When I tried to get inside Shelley's, I found I was getting really radical. I was beginning to start arguing loudly at dinner parties about freedom of the press and this sort of thing. I found Shelley completely exhausting, actually, as not so much as a subject, as a personality, because you know, in all these books, I'm not so much trying to just relate the life, but I really want to catch it. I want to catch the sort of moving spirit of the person. And he was such a volatile creature, in some ways, you know, exhilarating, in other ways, fairly awful. And it just seemed to me that all the time I was being worn out by this character. But I mean, the way that book appeared was extraordinary in itself. I was staying at a B&B in Sussex, and I was reading a different book which suddenly quoted some lines from the Ode to the West Wind. And it was as if I'd actually been picked up by the wind and taken somewhere. I mean, I was when I say literally swept off my feet, it wasn't quite, but I really felt that that was what it was. And I immediately went up and said to my husband, we've got to go into Brighton, we've got to buy Shelley's poems. So we went, and the rest of the holiday I was just reading his poetry. I've never been sort of seized by a subject in that rather violent way before.
Have you ever I've known authors who are writing long biographies who halfway through suddenly fall completely out of love with their subject. Has that happened to you?
No, it hasn't. If anything, I think I got fonder of them, as most of them. I mean, the book that was really most difficult was the next one from Shelley, which was on Orpheus. The great difficulty with him was that he wasn't really real, of course. I mean, you could say perhaps he was he's far more likely to have been just a mythological figure, the personification of.
I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of watching a seminar program. I'll get back
Very
to you.
sorry.
All right, thank you.
Liz, could you unmute
Bye.
mute yourself, please?
Sorry, I'll go back to the beginning.
Sorry about that.
Just to say that I pretty well did fall out of love with Orpheus, I must say. It was a very, very difficult subject. I was trying to catch a personality, but he was a myth, I think, fairly obviously. He was the personification of poetry and song. And therefore, you know, I felt I was actually grasping at a ghost. I couldn't really get to grips with him until I went to Bulgaria and actually to the sites, the mountains and plains and so on, where he was supposed to have been active. And oddly enough, that really brought him alive to me. I mean, I hope it comes alive a bit more in the book too. Up to that point, until I'd made that journey, I actually did throw the manuscript away when I got about 2/3 through. But then I realized I'd still got the memory stick. So I thought, oh, well, it's like Byron throwing his manuscript in the fire when he'd got another copy of it. You know, I had got this stick, and I was going to go and throw that into one of the Hampstead ponds, but I was talked out of it by a friend. And so in the end, the book came to be. And I think it does just about work. Not that I'm really a judge of my own stuff, but I can still remember the agonized wail of my American editor down the phone, but Orpheus isn't real. You know, you can't write this book. You can't do this to me. I think it can be written about, but that was a struggle, that book.
You're in Brighton. You're buying Shelley. Were you also buying your flat?
No, it was about 8 years later that we bought it.
Right.
Yes, 2009. Thank heaven we've got it, because, you know, the minute lockdown was announced, I was off there, the same as you've gone off to your lovely cottage in Suffolk. And living in Brighton has been wonderful. And the one compensation of lockdown has been to be by the sea all the time.
The next book, 6 Facets of Light, is very much a Brighton, Sussex, Downs book.
Yes.
Again, another completely radical departure from everything that's come before.
Yes, it was just the light in Brighton, the South Coast light, you know, that comes from the chalk and the sea, and it simply took me by storm. And I actually wanted to write a biography of Ravilius at that point. But I got in touch with his daughter, and his daughter told me there were 2 biographies coming down the pike, as indeed there were, and they were good ones. And so I thought, well, I've got to somehow get an excuse to include Ravilius somehow in something. And so gradually I produced the book on light. And it was beautiful to me to be able to write about nature. I had never done it before. To be able to be a nature writer, I think that was probably a longing that I had inside and hadn't indulged until light. But I also felt it was a biography in a strange way. And there was one version of the manuscript where I actually went through and capitalized light all the way through just to see if it would work as a character. And it did seem to work. But then I thought it was a bit pretentious, and I wouldn't try and sell it as a biography, even though I do feel that that's where what my American editor used to call my career path. I feel that's really what I am doing, is writing about lives. But I think light is its own self. It was a very nice subject to do. Simply,
And a lot of other characters in it as well as Ravilius.
there's Samuel Palmer, there's many of the poets I'm fondest of, Dante and Blake, and yes, there are a good number of characters in it. Yes, Whitman, I can't think of all the characters. There are certainly, a dozen or more. And I suppose there's not so many that you're losing track of them. There are a definite dozen or so that I really wanted to focus on, because I thought they had really considered light more deeply than other people. Hopkins was another one.
Yes.
Great favorite.
And forgive me, I don't have any of your books. They're all in London, so I can't consult them in Suffolk. But if I remember rightly, you were putting, this is when you began to put your own verse in the book.
Yes, I've been writing poetry for quite some time, but I didn't really start doing it so much, I suppose, until probably after my husband died, because he wrote poems and I didn't want to be always kind of getting in his way and under his feet, if you like, because I was writing in enough other things. But I started to do more. And I'd got quite a few poems that particularly thought about light. And I also felt there were certain things, many things, that poetry could catch in a way prose couldn't. And since I'm always so obsessed with this idea of catching the soul or the spirit of something, it seemed an ideal medium. And I put little fragments, little patches and snatches into light. But I put them in italics so that, because I had a lot of other really good, wonderful poets in there. And I thought if mine are in italics, then readers can skip. And they think, oh, it's that awful woman again with a bit of her stuff. I won't bother with that. But I still went on writing it, and I'm still writing it. And that was how I came to do the book about St. Francis in poetry, not least because his whole life seems to me to be a song of praise to God, and therefore poetry seemed the ideal medium for it.
And were you surprised by the reception that the book got?
Yes, totally. To tell you the truth, I was terrified. Sorry, I was put off by the message on the screen there. I was terrified that you would like it, actually. When I delivered it, I thought, oh, Lord, why have I done that? Why have I sent it to Dan? He doesn't want poetry. Oh, this is awful. Can I claw it back somehow? But I kept it with you. And when you sent the email back, which said Francis on it, obviously, as the title, I didn't open it for a week. I thought, I just can't bear this. And then you liked it. I just shouldn't be such a coward. But of course, it was something quite different from what
I was, of course, I was suffering from similar nerves at my end, in that Cape has a very well-known poetry list, which I don't run. It is run by my then colleague, Robin Robertson, who is one of the hardest nuts to crack in the whole of publishing. So I knew I couldn't publish it unless he read it and liked it. So I passed it to him when I finished, and he loved it. And the rest was history. There's a lovely review, and Kate Kellaway said, in our secular age, this book seems literally heretical, triumphantly unfashionable. It does what poetry is meant to do and seldom does. It takes you to another place while making you reflect on what it is to be here. Even as a non-believer, you want to hold on to this writing as if to a book of prayer, which I thought was a wonderful way of looking at it.
Yes.
Okay, we've reached 7:04. Can you just say a few words about your career as an obituary writer, and how you go about it? And crucially, there's been one collection of your obituaries,
Yes.
which went up to kind of 10 years ago or something.
It was 2008. They're not all mine. They're half my predecessors. So half of them seem very different from mine. And he was a lovely writer, but he was much more judgmental than I am. I mean, I find that the books and the obituaries really feed into each other, and they're really informed by the same thought that I want to catch lives. I want to try and catch these spirits. So I just try and hone in on the essence of the person if I can. I've only got 1,000 words, so that is simply not enough, to go through the life with the schooling and the marriages and all the rest of it. It just has to be an attempt to dive in and sum somebody up. And I do very much want to try and tell the story through their eyes, not my eyes. I don't want to be standing in judgment over people, even bad people, because I think they hang themselves with their own rope most of the time. You don't have to add anything to that. And it's been wonderful doing the obituaries. I think it is the nicest job on The Economist. I asked if I could have it when my predecessor was going to retire, and I'm glad that Bill Emmett, who was then the editor, said yes. That was a great moment, and I've loved them ever since. I keep them.
But you decide on Monday?
Yes, we decide on Monday lunchtime, really, and I have to have it written by Tuesday, 5 o'clock, and sent to the editor. So it's a crazy time of really just immersing myself in a character. I used to run to the London Library when our office was in St. James's Street, run there to see if there were any autobiographies, because I base them usually on autobiography and memoir and interviews. Now we're just a bit further away down the Strand, so it's become more of a trek. And of course, with lockdown, it's impossible. But there's an awful lot of Googling that goes on, and a lot of buying of books on Kindle, which means I can just about keep up with everything as I used to. And it's just total immersion for the whole of Monday afternoon and night. And then I write it.
I remember you describing to me, I think it may have been Saul Bellow, and you said, well, of course, I didn't read any of the biographies or anything, but I
didn't actually write the Saul Bellow. It was written by my deputy, Fiammetta Rocco, who was the book.
But it must have been another, when you said you just read all the novels, and I thought, blimey.
Oh gosh, who was that, I wonder? What a boast. I can't remember who it was. I do read an awful lot. I have a sort of speed reading mechanism that has to kick in when I'm doing the obituaries. It's very.
How do you decide who to do that week?
Almost literally a bell will sound in my head. I mean, unless it is someone very famous and unavoidable. I think most recently John le Carré was one, and that was a speed read, if you like, because I think I had even less time to do him, but fortunately, I had read the books, if rather long ago. Yes, unless it's someone unavoidable, I can almost hear a bell go off that tells me that is a good story and that's the one. And I'm never more delighted than when it's someone rather unknown, just an ordinary character who's got caught up in something, or suddenly come into the news for a quite random reason. I mean, sometimes it's the victim of an explosion, or gosh, what might it be? Difficult to think, but they're quite often people I've never heard of, and someone will have recommended them. They're sometimes neighbors of people. I find those simply wonderful, because there you are presenting a really fascinating life that has just been lived mostly on the quiet and no one has known about it.
And wonderful. And will there be a collection of yours?
Well, I am asked about it, but I'm afraid the last one really didn't sell. And it was thought that it didn't sell because people still don't like talking about death. And they don't like having books on their shelves that suggest death. I don't feel that way about death. I very much take Rilke's view that it's another stage of life. And therefore, I don't feel any sort of sadness or badness about covering it so intensely. But it's not the general view, I suppose. And so I don't think the feeling's very strong among the book sales reps at the Economist that they want to do it again, sadly.
Okay, Nick, I think we should probably move to questions.
Yes.
Okay.
They seem to be pouring in.
Well, actually, everyone's being quite reticent, as is often the case. So I would encourage you to keep on sending questions through the chat. But maybe I could start by asking you something. And well, actually, there's a small point. You were just talking about Le Carré. There's a 600-page biography, authorized biography by Adam Sisman, plus Le Carré's own The Pigeon Tunnel. Did you read either of those?
No. For some reason,
Adam
I
Sisman isn't
couldn't.
among the audience. So.
Well, I had to do that one so fast.
Yes.
Actually, I rather indulged myself because I really miss actually being in that part of North London. I live right by Hampstead Heath, and Le Carré uses Hampstead Heath a fair bit in the Carla trilogy, with Smiley wandering there. And so I really did it through him communing with Smiley on Hampstead Heath, which saved me reading enormous amounts of stuff. I only kind of read small amounts of stuff. So that was how that one came to be.
Sheila Allen has asked, who was your favorite subject and who was your least favorite?
What, in the books?
I imagine she's talking about the obits.
Oh, in the obits, my goodness, that's very, very difficult to say. Because I often feel I wish I'd known the people I've written about. It isn't really, I think it's not really a question of having a favorite one or an unfavorite one, but feeling, have I done this person justice? Mind, or haven't I? I think my reaction is purely as to whether I feel I've managed to catch them or not. If I don't think I have, then I think it's not a good piece, and I'm just kind of rather out of sorts with it. And if I pride myself that I have, then I like it, and then I feel good about the subject. It's a strange thing, but there are hundreds of them now, these obituaries. And there are many that I'm very fond of.
Can
you went from
is one allowed to ask a question?
Okay, Carol.
Yes, a voice, or do I have to type it? What I want to know is, how often have you had to, or would it be difficult or more difficult to write obituaries of people you've actually known, who are friends or people you've worked with?
It doesn't happen very often, actually. I mean, yes, I can only think of two. There was one I did of MRD Foote, who I knew, and that wasn't too difficult to do. He was a good friend. When I did Seamus Heaney's, I knew him a bit, but he was not a close friend, but I'd often met him and talked to him at various events and conferences we were at. I must say I felt his death like the falling of a great tree. I was absolutely shattered by his death. He was much too young. And I think that was the one I probably wrote with the most feeling of personal sadness at what had happened.
You moved with a book in between from Pilate, about whom there's hardly any documentation, to Shelley, about whom there's quite a lot.
Just too much, yes, absolutely.
Was it a very different experience writing those two books?
Well, yes, it was. I was very annoyed with myself for having got a subject who had so much written about him, so many biographies. It was really quite annoying. And I think the reason that I very strictly put it into themes of the 4 elements was because I didn't want to be anything like the other biographies. And I feel I could only justify it if it was very different in its approach. I mean, the facts in it are probably the same, but because they're in a different order and it's from a different perspective, it will seem different. And I wrote it very heavily from the notebooks, from Shelley's notebooks, because I wanted to get the feeling of him writing poetry and the feeling of his spirit, dealing with the poetry, bringing it in and putting it down with the deletions and so on, which is so extraordinary to see. Although I also did think at the time I would be furious if somebody went through my books and wrote out, you know, the original poem that I'd had in mind and didn't pay attention to my deletions. You know, I get rid of all my drafts. I didn't want anyone to know.
I can't find the question now, but it was to do with to what extent you feel justified in an imaginative recreation of a life when the documentary evidence is lacking or incomplete.
I try to be quite careful about the imaginative part of it. I mean, I do think, and my training was as a historian, so I'm pretty rigorous about, for example, not inventing dialogue. I'm very, very uneasy about historical novels for this reason. I really am annoyed by the dialogue, not so much because it's archaic and anachronistic, which it sometimes is, but even when it's very good, you know, even when it's Hilary Mantel, who I am very fond of, I just find it, it worries me that this probably didn't happen and they probably didn't say those things to each other. I mean, I should just put it aside. This is fiction, this is something else. But as I say, I've had quite a rigorous training in it. And yes, I think the imagination really comes in if you are describing objects. I know when I was writing about 14th century France, the fact that the feel of a fleece is the same now as it was then, or the light of a candle or something like that. You can add words to it that bring it to life and are not defying history because it's still true. You know, just, if you just bring in those little touches, I just think it was a bit like a painter with a paintbrush, just touching in little color here and there. I mean, that's what I allowed myself to do. With Pilate, I was always referring back to whatever source it was, like the mystery plays. So I would say, you know, the Pilate of the Chester play went out and did this, for example, because he does do that. But of course, the Pilate who really lived didn't do that at all. But you do know where you are, I hope.
Monica Kendall asks, do you travel to the places your subjects have been? Is the spirit
well,
of place
as I said,
yes,
as I said, I did with Orpheus, and that made all the difference. I did Shelley. I was very annoyed that I went to Lerici and went to the boathouse and of course couldn't get in because it's now a private house. But then I saw, I think it was Peter Ackroyd, yes it was, standing on the balcony of the house at Lerici. And I thought, oh, you know, some people have real pulling power and I don't. But yes, I found it was very important with Shelley to see the places. Perkin Warbeck, I went to quite a lot of those places, certainly Ireland, Scotland. I mean, he was all over the place. I had to get documents from so many different archives around Europe. Generally, yes. I think I have traveled to the places and I recommend it.
Nicolette Jones asks, you talked about trying to capture the spirit of a person. Do you also try to see the shape of a life? Do you think lives follow an arc, or are they a random sequence of events?
No, well, that's a good question. I had a big argument with Brenda Maddox once, of course, is a wonderful biographer, because she said you can't write in this way in themes and avoiding chronology because one thing leads to another in a life. And I think certainly that's often true, but I also think that one incident sheds light on another at a different time. And incidents can sort of reinforce obsessions or reinforce, how shall I put this, sort of reinforce a progression towards something that's already happening. It's tricky, but I've never felt that chronology really helped a life. I think it too soon gets into rather a trudge, and you're expecting certain things to happen at certain ages and so on. And that if you write by themes, you can manage to bring in the facts of a life. But I don't know whether there's an arc to a life. Having said I don't think there really is, I often find in my obituaries, I sort of automatically end up in the last paragraph in the later years, even though I won't have begun with the birth. And I won't have been a bit chronological all the way through this piece, but somehow as a sort of valedictory, it seems, and a summary of the life, it seems you do go back to old age by the end of it.
It can often be difficult for biographers of writers to have a strictly chronological approach, because by the time the writer becomes a success, his or her life becomes less interesting for the reader. It's the events that formed that person and early struggles that are interesting.
That's right. There's often a rather long fallow period when they don't do very much. And yet you feel you've somehow got to follow them through it. And I say, why? You know, don't bother about it. You know, unless there's a really interesting mental struggle going on that you can mention somehow. No.
Well, the Carrey would be an example, you know, spying his extraordinary father. But by the time he gets to 50 odd, he's, you know, settled in his second marriage and writing books, and that's what he does.
Yes, I suppose a settled life can be a little bit dull.
Frances Spalding asks, she confesses not to having read Pilate, but she asked the question, why did Pilate say, "What I have written, I have written," in response to the challenge about the phrase about Christ being King of the Jews?
What was the early part of that, Nick?
Why did Pilate say, "What I have written, I have written"?
Yes.
In response to...
Why did he say that? I don't know. All these New Testament accounts of Pilate are really quite tricky to work out. I've always felt that the famous Pilate question, what is truth, has a pretty authentic ring to it, because it suddenly pops up and it's such a strange thing. You know, it seems very random. And then, of course, as Bacon says, he doesn't wait for an answer. He just goes off again. So I tend to think that there's a bit of truth in these dialogues that we have in the New Testament. And it seems to me that there is a definite point in the trial of Christ when Pilate is worried. He's worried because it seems that Jesus has come not from Galilee, but from somewhere else, i.e. perhaps he's come from the heavens. Perhaps he is one of these gods who appear in disguise, and he would have been well aware of that sort of thing. There were plenty of examples in Roman mythology. And so he is actually worried. He was a very superstitious sort of man. He puts religious symbols on his coins, for example. He treats Tiberius as an absolute god, but that's partly for career reasons. And with this superstition, I think he was extremely worried by the decision he'd come to. And so by writing that inscription, in a sense, he was keeping his options open. He was mocking the Jews on one hand, but on the other hand, he was perhaps, you know, making a statement that he thought Christ was a bit more than he appeared to be to him.
Here's an interesting question from Lisa. Lisa, forgive me if I mispronounce your surname, Klimi. She asks, have you ever been drawn to write a longer book about, or a book about one of your obituary subjects?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think so, because to be honest, I've rather shied away from modern characters. This is partly because some of my friends have had a real struggle with the family when they've tried to write modern books. And I was rather worried about that with Ravilius, to be honest, when I thought of writing about him. So no, I think the answer is no. The furthest I would go is to say, as I have, that I often wish I'd known these people. But I don't want to write long books about them.
A couple of people have asked that question that writers hate, and I suspect you dislike more than most, is are you working on something at the moment? When will you be ready to tell us what it is?
No, I'm certainly not telling you what it is. But I can see Dan laughing there. No, but I have been working on something, and it's poetry again. I will say that much, because I do feel at the moment, it's partly because of lockdown. I find it quite hard to focus on some huge project, some big project, and I like to write. In fact, I wrote quite a lot of poems early on in lockdown, the first lockdown, about how strange various things appeared to me through the guise of COVID. But I've just completed something, and I have just delivered it to my new editor at Cape. So, you know, I'm in that rather nerve-wracked state one is in before one gets the email, which one then doesn't open for a week.
Your colleague Andrew Miller writes, your writing always seems to me to be sort of metaphysical, i.e. an effort to collapse both time and the distance between individuals. Do you think that faith, with either a lower or an upper case, is essential to your method?
Was that fate or faith?
Faith.
Faith. Yes, that's interesting. It might be actually. I mean, certainly I don't think of this world as all there is, and I don't think of death as an ending. And therefore, I perhaps don't have such a sort of exact feeling of time or exact feeling of when a life comes to an end and is completed. I'm looking on life as a continuum. And also, I think, as a sort of continual communion between ourselves and the people who've gone before us. I don't really believe that any great spirits ever leave the earth. And I think the vibration really of all that has been said and done probably stays in some way in the atmosphere. So there's a continual communion going on of beings, and we just try and grasp some of it. And I suppose if I can collapse it and bring what I can a bit closer, then certainly I'm rather glad to try to do that.
Michael Moran, I think we'll make this the last question. Or it says all your subjects are eminent or possibly notorious. And have you ever been tempted to write a biography of an ordinary figure? And I suppose in the way that Alexander Masters has done, someone not at all known, but describe why that person is fascinating.
A whole biography of that. Yes, I'm not sure, because I do so enjoy writing those sort of obituaries. It is strange that I haven't really tried someone unknown, although that was one of the great attractions of Pilate, that although he wasn't unknown, he wasn't anyone in particular. I mean, he was an official in Judea, but that was not a very great posting to have. And he was a pretty ordinary soldier, it was mostly what he was, completely out of his depth in Judea. So in a sense, you're dealing with an ordinary bloke there, which is, I must say, the attraction when you can then place him in the whole plan of divine redemption of the world, you know. I did like that contrast. It was very provocative. I might think about writing of someone unknown, but I just have a feeling that editors and publishers would look very askance at that. I mean, Alexander Masters has managed it, but I'm not sure how many, no, Dan would know this, how much people celebrate in the publishing houses if they get a biography of someone totally unknown. I think even autobiography is a bit tricky. I'm not sure anyone would want to read about my life, for example. Although I do like writing poetry partly because it is a way to get deeper inside myself.
There is one more question here, and I'll ask it because it's by your colleague, Daniel Franklin.
Oh.
Are you able to let go of the people you've written about after finishing an obituary, or do they stay with you?
I think they always stay with me. Certainly the biography, the biographical characters have stayed with me. Quite a few of the obituary characters stay as well, in fact, if their stories are very haunting. I found especially when I did obituaries of these soldiers in the First World War, because I did obituaries, I think of 4 or 5 of them who were the last French infantrymen or the last cavalrymen on the Western Front, this sort of thing. They were very ordinary. Of course, you know, they just happened to have been the last and therefore they came to my notice. But I do often think about them. And I'm also slightly haunted, I think, by people who died too young. You know, the people who, as I said, were caught up in explosions or were killed in war, or the younger people I've written about whose lives haunt me because they weren't finished. And you don't know how they would have been finished. But they had dreams of them, which you can reconstruct. And then that's very poignant, of course.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. I'm just going to hand back now to Jane.
It's a huge pleasure, Nick. Thank you.
Jane, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Good.
And but Ariane is you know, unmute Ariane.
Hello.
Hello.
Anne, I just want to thank you and Dan, of course, as well, for such an incredibly enlightening conversation. I mean, you have absolutely caught the moving spirit of the person. You've triumphantly liberated biography from the arc of chronology, to my mind, and I love your obituaries. I always turn to the last page of the Economist every week, and I read it backwards, starting with you. And I take a lot of those extraordinary lives away with me. They're so moving, I find. As you say, especially the ones who died young, like you wrote the other day about the African goat herd.
Oh, yes, what a story that was.
Story, extraordinary things, which certainly stay with me. So we are so thrilled that you are the recipient of this award. We hope you'll enjoy your engraved Mont Blanc pen and continue using it to throw light on many, many lives to come. And thank you very much, and to Dan, and to all of you. There are so many of you here for coming to this event, and we hope we'll see you at our next one. So,
Ariane, thank you so much, and to the Biographers Club again.
Delighted.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.